Welcome. Very exciting panel here. We have two leaders who, in their own arena, in their own space, business and law enforcement, have decided to support and advocate for immigration reform in their own little worlds. So they've come to sort of agree, to use a cliche, that immigrants make America great.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I had to say it. So let's just get right into it. Mr. Holden, let me begin with you. So in the past few years, you work with Koch Industries, and you have been very, very involved in criminal justice reform issues on a very successful level, collaborating with unlikely partners, different stakeholders, with current and previous administrations, bipartisan effort. Can you tell us how and why you and Koch Industries, devoted so much time to that, and then how you went to immigration reform? Why immigration reform?
Well, thanks for having me here today. I'm very excited about it. These are big issues for sure. So Koch Industries and within our Stand Together network, including Americans for Prosperity, we're very focused on removing barriers to opportunity for people. And the criminal justice system is a huge barrier to opportunity for millions of Americans, and it has been for many decades. And unfortunately, the way we're handling immigration now in our country has become like that. And so we want to remove these barriers to opportunity because we think it's important, particularly we're talking backstage, if in our country, if you're here, you're an immigrant unless you're a Native American or something, right? So we're a country of immigrants. That was the essay that John F. Kennedy wrote many years ago, and then it's appropriate we're in the Ronald Reagan building today because you all probably remember his last speech as President of the United States. It was a love letter to immigrants, and I could read some of it from there. If you want to see one of the things, I'm sorry, it just really.
Please do, yeah.
I've read this many times in the past, but I'm just getting ready for this event today. So it's President Reagan says, "This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow." And there's a lot more in here like that. And so from my perspective, from a policy perspective, it took way too long to get criminal justice reform done, but it finally happened because of what the states did, the laboratories of liberty in the states. And the states didn't follow what was happening at the federal level. I go back, I graduated law school in '88, and I remember the Willie Horton era. I worked in a prison when I was younger, and prisons were terrible. And there's, reasons for that, obviously, but there was nothing going on to make people better or make communities safer. And back then, if you told me in 1988, then into '89, when President Reagan made this speech, the last speech, if you told me that we would get comprehensive criminal justice reform done in a positive way and not do anything on immigration, so from '90 to then, we haven't done anything, but we did it on criminal justice reform, I would have said there's no way. It just can't happen. It's just way too much. It's just been such a from left and right, and Willie Horton to the Clinton crime bill, et cetera. But that happened, and it happened because the states showed it worked. That you could keep communities safer, keep law enforcement safer, which is obviously extremely important, and you could reduce crime rates, reduce incarceration rates, and have money for other reasons than locking people up. And so what we're saying is that based on data and evidence and science and anecdotal, all these different reasons why we've decided this works at the criminal justice level in the states. We did it at the federal level last year, and it was great. It wasn't easy. When it took 5 or 6 years, these things do. But during that time, when we were getting into the run-up last year, I remember right before the first Step Act came out, it was just about prison reform, and it was Doug Collins and Hakeem Jeffries. And Hakeem they're all heroes to me, but Hakeem was such a hero because he was getting a lot of grief. Don't do this, don't play this game, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to vote for it. The Democrats were saying, well, they did vote for it. We had these huge, huge bipartisan votes for it, 360. Then we got to the Senate, and the Senate, well, you're not going to be able to do anything there. Well, it happened there as well. And so it's all based on data and evidence, right? And so I think to myself, okay, that makes sense. That's what we should be doing in all our policies. What will make us safer? What will make us better? Well, guess what? Guess what has one of the longest histories of data and science and information, anecdotal, empirical, evidence, whatever you want to call it? Immigration. I mean, let's be real. It's been from the beginning of our country. We had, it was in the Constitution, immigration, right? And then 1790, we had the first immigration bill passed. It's basically our DNA, and for some reason now, if we're going to follow the data and the information and the science, we should be all over making our immigration system better for everybody. And that's really right now, it's not a lack of data or science, it's a lack of political will. And I can talk about that more, but I'll stop.
Yep.
And I think
I like that.
there are a lot of corollaries to the criminal justice system. I'll talk about that later.
Sure.
But this should be easy because everybody here is an immigrant or knows someone or whatever. And if we're not going to do this, I don't see how we're going to survive as a country, quite frankly.
So yeah, we'll get into the
Yeah.
analogies and lessons later, but Chief Best, now let me ask you about your world. How have you been involved in supporting immigration reform and why?
Sure. Well, let me start with this because I'm just glomming onto some of the stuff that you just said.
Yeah.
Look, we know that unfortunately throughout history, whether people be African American, LGBTQ, Latino, whatever, when they've cried out for freedom and justice and rights, often law enforcement was used to uphold the status quo. And we weren't on the right side of history. So we have to acknowledge that. We start from a place where we acknowledge that. But we also look now to really move on, to really engage and be a part of the community and helping every person in the community. And when we talk about these issues of immigration in particular, there's 3 areas that I think about that really it focuses on. One is just the humanitarian aspects of it. What is happening? How are we treating other people as humans? The other is the national and border security. What happens there? How are we keeping our borders safe and secure? And then the third prong is the public safety aspect. And that's where I feel like law enforcement, really, that is our lane and where we should be. I really feel indebted to the National Immigration Forum and Ali Noorani and those who come together to talk about all of the various aspects. But the public safety aspect and the Law Enforcement Immigration Task Force, leitf.org, is a subgroup of law enforcement officials, police chiefs and sheriffs, over 120 of us from across the country, representing 30 states, to talk about where we agree on what has often been an incredibly polarizing issue of immigration. So I thank them for that. It's leitf.org. If you're in policing, that's Lincoln Edward Ida Tom Frank.org. Look it up. But it's really important that we have these conversations, that we come together on what we have in common and what we share. And I wanted to make sure that I had the opportunity to talk about those principles, just so that I don't miss anything. So I'm going to look at my phone here. But one is that when immigrants feel safe in communities, communities are safer. The second principle that we agree upon, state and local law enforcement should target criminals, not contributing members to our society and our community. Federal law enforcement should focus its priorities toward catching serious criminals and the security threats that we talked about a little bit earlier. A large legal workforce encourages respect and the rule of law. Immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility, and state and local law enforcement need adequate resources to do their work, and I would say federal law enforcement as well. So those are the principles that we all can agree upon. And once we get to that point where we've agreed upon those principles, then we can have discussions about what we do in our local jurisdictions. I recently was announced as one of the co-chairs for the Immigration Task Force. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Chief Art Acevedo from the Houston Police Department, who's a co-chair, as well as Sheriff Margaret Mims, who is also a co-chair. And with me, from my own county, our sheriff, who's also joined, Mitzi Johanknick. Thank you for being here. I know that there are other people who represent other law enforcement agencies who are a part of that Immigration Task Force. Again, working really hard every day to make sure that we provide public safety for everybody. And we're not safer if people in our community who live there, who work there, who reside there, don't feel comfortable calling the police if something bad happens. And in fact, they make themselves much more vulnerable if we're not engaging them, because then people will exploit the fact that they know that they won't call for law enforcement. So we know we're much better off when we are embracing people, when we're making sure that our communities are safer. All the data out there has already shown that people who are undocumented are not the ones that are committing, as some of the rhetoric you may have heard, all the crime. In fact, much less than our own citizens. So, you know, we have to acknowledge the truth of the research and the data, making sure that we're keeping people safer by engaging them and involving them and making those connections in our communities.
So, Mr. Holden, let's talk about some of those lessons that you learned. So, you know, you became incredibly invested in criminal justice reform. How did you, and Koch Industries, frankly, educate, you know, your network of supporters, corporate leaders that follow you? How did you educate them on criminal justice reform, and how do you do the same thing on immigration reform? Like you said, the data is there.
Right.
You know, how do you transfer, you know, that knowledge, or convince them, you know, that this is the right thing to do?
Well, and I'm just an editorial aside. I'm befuddled that people don't understand how important immigration is in this country, and the way we talk about it is just terrible, which is similar to how we've talked about people in the criminal justice system. You know, they're ex-cons, they're criminals, or this or that. And we have that same language sometimes with people coming here for a better life. So, you know, what we did, I have a long history in the criminal justice system from a young age, where I was arrested when I was 17 for doing some things I definitely should not have been doing at 17 or even older. And, you know, I come from Worcester, Mass. We did not have many resources, and we have a system, obviously, that's based on resources and connections, two-tiered system. But we did have a connection. I lived across the street from the sheriff of Worcester County, Frank Degnan, who's a great guy. And instead of getting a criminal record and all these other things that come with that, I got a job at the jail, at the local jail. And so, you know, I benefited from that. And there were a bunch of people I grew up with that I played sports against and went to school with who were incarcerated because they were knuckleheads that didn't have connections or money and drug addictions and all these other things. And so that was early in my life. I saw that firsthand. And, you know, Charles Koch and David Koch, David unfortunately passed away last August, but they've been very much against the war on drugs and mandatory minimums. They want a just system, a fair system. They want a system that keeps everybody safe and treats everybody with dignity and respect, from law enforcement to people who are the victims of crimes, to people who allegedly commit the crimes, to people who are convicted, people in prison, the people working in prisons, the communities, you name it. We want a system that works like that, and we want a system that gives people second chances and is fair and just and is redemptive. So that's been Charles's belief for a long time. And we had a case where in our company where the rubber really met the road, where some of our employees were charged with something and it went away. They were exonerated, but it gave us a first-hand look at what the system's like, and we had the resources to be able to stick with our employees and help them get lawyers and all these other things, and it came out okay. And after that was done, Charles just asked the question, did the system work like the way we thought it should? And we were like, no. I mean, we had information in the grand jury that had been doctored by someone, we don't know who. You know, it's just the over-criminalization. They were getting 20, 30 years were some of the things they were throwing out, the prosecutors. And so Charles said, well, let's try to make it better. And so we started working on that a few years after that. And we just found it wasn't even, hey, we have to work with liberal groups and conservative groups. It was just natural because people agreed on these issues by and large, not on everything, but we agreed on enough. And, you know, we first started out, the first coalition we got together was Koch and the Heritage Foundation and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And there was agreement on these different issues, and it just built over time. You know, Van Jones, who's a good friend of mine, before that, you know, he got fired by he talks about it, the White House, because of activities or some stuff that people from AFP put out there. And now we're good friends. I mean, he just brought things together, and over time, we didn't focus so much on what we disagreed on, we focused what we agreed on. And you can build a coalition doing that, and we've been able to do it. And again, the data was key. It's always key, particularly in anything like this. It's public safety first, keep everybody safe. But we've got that, and I think, you know, your point, we've got it with immigration too. We have a lot of data about what the real, you know, what is really going on, and the value that immigrants provide to our country for whatever it is in communities, entrepreneurial, you name it. We've got all that, we know that, but we're in a place now, and as you mentioned, we have been in the past. I mean, our history is between welcoming people who are different, and then you're welcome but not so much, and then you can go to internment camps or whatever. So it hasn't been perfect, but we're in a place now where for some reason people are going back to where we were and not looking at the ways we can work together to make it better, the pie bigger for everyone, and think it's a zero-sum game. And from my perspective, it would be pretty easy to do our own First Step Act type bill at the federal level for immigration, something around the Dreamers, and a permanent solution for them that leads hopefully to citizenship. I mean, for us for Congress to kick that to the president now is at the Supreme Court, that's monstrous. That's just immoral, man. I mean, we can't do that. People's lives are on the line. So there'd be something like that, and then the border security issues. I think a couple of years ago there were billions of dollars that both sides seemed okay with, but from my perspective, that would be a great place to start, for sure. And we've got a booming economy. I know people are worried about they're going to take the jobs and do this. We've got 7.2 million jobs in this country that go wanting every year. There's a lot for everybody. We can make this pie bigger and bigger. And that's been the story of our history with immigration.
So let me quickly follow up. You mentioned earlier that you thought that, or you think that immigration reform should be easier than the criminal justice reform. And I was a little bit struck by that because maybe it's that I become too cynical, but the data is there, and yet not.
I don't know enough about it is probably why.
No, that's not what I mean to say. No, I mean what I wanted to follow up on is, you mentioned that a basic principle of criminal justice reform is that it's this idea of redemption, right? Like we cannot throw away the key and lock everybody up. Right. And so in immigration reform, there's this fundamental underlying, I guess, question of illegality versus legality that doesn't really exist in the criminal justice reform. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about how do you apply that same principle of redemption in the immigration reform world? Yeah,
I mean, I never use the phrase illegal immigrant. I mean, they're human beings. No human is illegal. People do things they shouldn't do, but I think this goes back to our lack of political will and not making our system work better for everybody.
Sure.
And we haven't done it since 1990. That was the last comprehensive immigration reforms. So, I know there's been a lot of different things on the table on different issues, but I guess from my perspective, we're in one of those times where people are kind of slamming on immigrants for whatever reason and afraid of them, and that's not a good place to be. And I really think that this is the exact opportunity, the exact opportune time to do it, particularly with all the things we need in our country. I mean, from a business perspective, we've got, or an education perspective, we educate people, then they go back to their home country and do great things. We don't benefit from that necessarily. I know at Coke, we've got 140,000 people around the world, and we have to hire the best people. That's why we ban the box and hire people with criminal records since I've been with the company. We just want the best people, regardless of what, whether they have a criminal record or not. We just want the best people. We've hired dreamers. I say it's simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Yeah. We know what we need to do, and start with the dreamers issue. I think I bet that's a 70 or 80% issue in polls. One thing on this is when the criminal justice issues, when we got it out of the House, but it was dying in the Senate. Mike Lee kept saying, Senator Mike Lee, there are 75 votes for this bill in the Senate, and he had a hard time with leadership. And ultimately, they did a whip count because everyone was pushing, putting a lot of pressure on him, and it turned out there were a lot of votes there. There were actually 87 votes for it. 87. There should have been 89, but one senator was out of the country, another one was mad at another senator, so he voted against it. I don't know. No, seriously, that's what happened. So my point is, though, this is something I bet if we had you let Congress vote anonymously, this thing would pass with flying colors. They would, but that's why we need political will, and hopefully that'll happen. This is a place to start, and then these other things we can work on. I think a lot of the whatever it is, negative thoughts about people coming from other countries now is that people feel left out in other parts of the country. But we've got so many jobs open right now, and part of the thing is we haven't trained people, they haven't thought it, saw it, they haven't got the education. We can do all these things, and we need to do them. Not doing anything isn't an option. It just isn't.
So Chief Best, in your, from your perspective, what do you think is the best approach, to bringing people of diverse opinions to the table? In your case, there are obviously many conservative law enforcement agents. Sure. So how do you bring both to the table to agree upon, why this makes sense?
Well, I read earlier like the 6 principles that we agree upon, but public safety should not be a partisan issue. People just need to feel safe in the area. It shouldn't be related to politics, and it shouldn't be related to special interests. It's about making sure that everyone that lives and works and is in our community feels safe to be in our community. Earlier on the panel, someone said, "Let me tell you a story." Well, let me tell you a story. So this morning, when I came in, I sat down at one of the tables out here and had coffee with a gentleman, and he started telling me about himself. And the fact that he came here when he was 6 years old from, I think, Bogota, Colombia. He's worked, he's been here, got educated here, has his degree here, has worked his entire life here in the U.S., and has made a good living for himself and been a productive, contributing member of society. So is this a person that if we stop them or if something happens, that we want our local law enforcement looking for these people to do, for those folks to do some sort of action against them? Why? Why would we, right? We really want to make sure people are safe. They're not being exploited and trafficked. And I'm going to tell you, when they feel vulnerable, they are. Employers use that information over people to, do some pretty horrendous things. And we as law enforcement have to come together, and we all agree upon safety. That's not a hard one for us. We swore in. For myself, I've been here almost 30 years. It's really important that communities feel safe and that everyone who's in that community feels safe. And most of us agree on that principle. There's very few people you're going to be able to say, well, is it okay if those folks are safe and these folks aren't? That's not how we operate. So from that perspective, I think there is common ground. We don't want to jump into any sort of this partisan, polarizing conversations. It doesn't do anything to help us advance and move forward. So I think most of us agree on that.
So, Mr. Holden, you mentioned earlier about in the criminal justice reform, the path to getting there. You mentioned that states had a role to play early on because they function as, laboratories of innovation, if you will. Can the same thing happen with immigration? We hear a lot right now about, states, preventing federal immigration enforcement or just doing their part to protect immigrants and to support immigrants. Is that something that you would support as well, or do you think that's the path to moving the needle?
I mean, if that's the only path, I guess that's the one you do, but I just keep getting back. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep saying the same thing. It's just, we really know what we need to do. We've done it so many times in our existence in this country, and now that there's somehow, this stain on certain people from certain places who didn't come in the way that they wanted people to do, and I'm not saying they should want people to do that, but I don't know if you're talking about like the sanctuary city stuff or what.
Yeah, I hate that term because there's no really, one definition of, and I hate using it. But yes, that's.
So what for me is that this is like the virtue seeking that both sides like to do. That this is our messaging. We're going to say this is a sanctuary city, and then we're for this. We want the wall. All this other stuff. It just doesn't go anywhere. It's not productive, and it's just whatever. People want to do it. I guess they can. I guess what I'd say is that, going back to what you said, Sheriff, that we should all be interested in public safety, and we should all be interested in any human being, regardless if they didn't come in through the right way, of being safe and being treated with dignity and respect. And I don't know how that looks, but it's like one of the things in the First Step Act, we had to pass a law that in the future, women who are pregnant can't be shackled while they're giving childbirth. Now, I'm glad they passed that law, but I mean, I don't think they do that stuff in Game of Thrones, but we had to pass a law to do it. My point is, these are things that we should be able to work on, and these are, this whole thing that we're going to round them up, we're going to do this or bad or that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I do think that, that communities need to be safe. The government has the federal government, it's in the Constitution, Article 1, this is something that the federal government has to deal with. States have interests as well to keep their citizens safe, but this is something we should all be uniting around. And I'm not Pollyanna, trust me, I'm from Worcester, Mass, I'm Irish Catholic. It's not the glass is half full, it's there's no glass, it's like nothing. So what I'm saying is, though, that these are things that we could solve and we can solve. If we can fix the criminal justice system after what we did from the Nixon era, where they basically have now admitted they did it to, destabilize communities of color and to lock people up and all these things, even though they knew it wasn't the right thing to do. If we could now come together on that criminal justice reform to get things done in a better way, this one, again, I think should be much easier because we've got so many centuries of experience and all the positive things, mostly positive things, pretty much that immigrants bring to our country and how it's mutually beneficial. That's what it's all about, right? So that's what we should be focused on and looking at. That's my point of view. And I'm sorry that we'd have to pass a law for that, but we should be able to figure this out, and it's up to Congress to do it, and they need to do it. And if they don't, they should all resign, I think. I'm serious. I'm not kidding. It's terrible.
Chief Bez, let me ask you the same kind of question, but in your experience, what are some of the programs or policies that you have implemented in Seattle, that you support, coming from law enforcement, to make immigrants or communities feel safer and to increase trust in those communities?
Great.
What are some of those?
Thank you for asking that.
Sure.
Let me just say first, that whole sanctuary city thing. Ask anybody the definition of a sanctuary city, and who can define it, and what does that mean, and what happens?
Doesn't make any sense.
And we've been sort of, I won't say the victim of, but we certainly have been, folks saying, well, that means that they're just going to let everybody criminal walk out the door. That's not what that means. If you commit a crime, you're going to get arrested, and we're going to deal with that like we would with anybody. And your documentation status does not factor into that. So just to clear the record in that way. But we are, what we would like to say, we welcome people. We want people to feel good and safe in our communities. As a part of that, at least in my agency, and many agencies are doing similar things, we have like an Immigrant Women's Institute and an Immigrant Families Institute, where officers meet with families from immigrant communities who've come in, and they talk to them about living here in different situations and things that they're encountering, to help build a relationship with them. And in the city of Seattle, our mayor has put forth that we will have a welcoming city. We have an Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. We work with them to communicate with every area of the community. We created a public service announcement that is in, I think, I have my assistant here, 8 languages? 8 different languages that people can see, that we encourage people to call 911, to understand that when we're responding, we're not going to ask about their immigration status. We want people to feel safe being able to help you be safe. Because heaven forbid it's your kid that gets hit and there's a witness right there and they're afraid to come forward because of immigration issues. So we really work hard on developing relationships. And I often say everything is about relationships. As you get to know people, they know you, they know how you operate, they know your philosophy, they know that you're not the enemy, but you're really there to help and keep everyone safe. And I think as long as we're being really intentional and deliberate about these programs, can't be happenstance. It's like, we want you actually out there shaking hands, patting people on the shoulder, doing whatever it is to make sure that people recognize that we are a part of the community and not apart from the community.
So meeting people where they are, basically.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask Mr. Holden, again, sorry for being so pushy on this issue, but thinking about corporate America, right? We all agree that the data is there, that immigrants are good for the country, and it is a question of political will. You said, if Congress doesn't pass this, they shall resign. So and I'm thinking about a cultural moment that happened recently around gun control reform. Remember when the El Paso massacre happened at a Walmart, and the CEO of Walmart came out publicly with a very, strong statement that, Walmart was not gonna sell handguns or ammunition in their stores, right? Everybody thought that would move the needle, didn't happen. So do you think something like that, something similar could happen with corporate leaders that could push Congress, because ultimately it is about the lack of political will.
Right.
What else can they do? How else can they get so in their face that they have no other choice but to do this?
Well, I know that the CEO that from my company, Charles Koch, has been very vocal on these issues and done op-eds with other unlikely collaborators like Tim Cook on the issue and the need for more and more people in our country because our demographics are going the wrong way, and we need more people because all types of people coming into the country, whether it's high skill, low skill, in between skill, these are critical jobs. There's dignity in work, and we want that to happen. I think there are big coalitions of business working on it, and they're lobbying about it. I guess it's just a matter of how we do things in our country for the past couple of at least 2 or 3 administrations now. We've got the executive, the president, signs executive orders. Congress then sues the executive, and it goes to the Supreme Court, which wasn't intended. So maybe it's going to be one of these things that if we keep pushing it, it'll be fine. I would hope, if the Supreme Court rules and says that this is unconstitutional, then maybe that'll lead to something. But I mean, it's like, it really shouldn't be that hard. It's kind of like we know what we need to do and how to do it. And to the extent that they don't want to do that, I don't know how they're going to be able to look in the mirror. So there are a lot of coalitions, business coalitions, our coalitions, and the groups we work with, Americans for Prosperity and Stand Together, on left, right, and center, we're working on these issues, and others, and it helps sometimes. But for whatever reason, we're in a place right now where Congress has an act and won't act, and I guess they're going to wait to see what the Supreme Court does. The hearings next week, and then we'll hear by the end of the year or the next term, and then that'll be the middle of middle of the campaign, and
right.
Nothing will. I don't know. Then that'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think that everybody should be making sure that their representatives, their senators, whoever it is, that this is a big issue, and this is completely immoral what we're doing. And it's contrary to the Constitution. It's contrary to their oath of what they were supposed to do. It really is, when you're kicking everything to the executive and not doing your job.
Yeah.
And they need to do it. And I think that, again, if people were pushed to do it today, they'd vote for something like we talked about, whether it's the border security plus the Dreamer thing. I bet it means, I think the White House, I've heard back different things, but I think they'd be for it. It's just a matter of pushing people to do it, but I don't see why we should wait to do that. It'd be great if someone would. I understand, I'm not naive. There's not going to be anything happening before the elections probably, but I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of people out there, probably as much more or as many people who've been working on the criminal justice issues. And it hasn't seemed to make a difference.
Well, on that note, I didn't want to leave with a negative sort of like outlook, but on that note, I just want to thank you for your thoughts and your insight. And thank you all for coming to the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you.